At just 4 years old, Charles Stratton was legally leased to P.T. Barnum by his own parents. To market him as a miniature adult, Barnum falsified his age as 11 and forced the preschooler to smoke cigars and consume wine on stage. Erased of his true identity and conditioned by adult substances before he even lost his baby teeth, Stratton remained a psychologically controlled corporate asset until his fatal stroke at 45. This is the unvarnished truth of P.T. Barnum's most exploited child star. Born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, on January 4, 1838, Charles Sherwood Stratton was a completely normal infant at birth. However, at 5 months old, a profound biological malfunction took hold of his developing body. His pituitary gland ceased its normal function, halting the elongation of his femurs, freezing the expansion of his rib cage, and locking his physical stature at a mere 25 inches. While his parents, a struggling carpenter and his wife, saw a fragile son requiring intensive medical care and protection, the outside world viewed him as a freak of nature. In the winter of 1842, a predator arrived at the Stratton household. Phineas Taylor Barnum was a man who possessed a chilling ability to look at human physical tragedy and calculate its exact monetary yield, bypassing any concept of medical assistance or educational support for the severely stunted child. Barnum simply laid a brutal commercial transaction on the table. He laid out a proposal that would fundamentally erase Charles's status as a human being. The carpenter, drowning in poverty, agreed to lease his 4-year-old son to the showman. The price for a human life for the total surrender of a child's developmental years was exactly $3 a week. With the signing of a crude piece of paper, a living, breathing preschooler was officially converted into leased property. Charles was no longer a son, he was inventory, destined to be shipped to the American Museum in New York City. Far exceeding the bounds of a mere employment contract, this document formalized the total legal confiscation of a developing human body. Every inch of Charles's stalled anatomy, his tiny hands, his fragile spine, and his arrested vocal cords now belonged to Barnum. The child's physical limitations were immediately weaponized to generate ticket sales, stripped of dignity and put on a pedestal for the masses to stare at. At an age when a child's neurological pathways are forming the foundational understanding of safety and familial love, Charles was ripped from his home. The comforting presence of his mother was replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a master manipulator. He was thrust into a suffocating environment filled with strangers, noise, and the constant glaring scrutiny of paying customers. The showman immediately began the grueling process of reprogramming the toddler. Normal play was forbidden, replaced by grueling hours of rehearsing unnatural movements and memorizing dialogue that a 4-year-old brain could barely process. His delicate joints and fragile muscles were forced to adapt to the rigorous demands of stage performance. The natural impulses of a young boy to run, to rest, to cry were systematically suppressed. Barnum demanded a product, and a crying toddler was not profitable. The boy had to be molded into a bizarre, compliant miniature adult. The parents, by accepting the weekly stipend, became complicit in this commodification. They handed over the total physical and psychological control of their offspring to a man whose only moral compass was profit. Charles possessed absolutely zero agency, his vocal cords and limbs moving entirely at the command of his purchaser. The initial exhibition was merely the testing ground for Barnum's grander, far more sinister design. He quickly realized that simply displaying a small child was not enough to sustain long-term financial growth. The public's appetite for the bizarre demanded a sharper, more grotesque narrative, one that would require the complete destruction of Charles's cognitive innocence. The sheer physical exhaustion of standing on display for hours on end began to take its toll on the 4-year-old's fragile frame. His tiny spine had to remain rigidly straight, his undeveloped leg muscles forced to bear his weight as thousands of eyes dissected his physical abnormality. The relentless gaze of the public was a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on a child who had no concept of why he was being stared at. There was no space for physical pain or emotional distress. If his joints ached from the unnatural postures, or if his head throbbed from the poor ventilation and constant noise of the museum, he was expected to endure it silently. As the first few weeks of the contract bled into months, the boy known as Charles Sherwood Stratton began to disappear. The normal developmental milestones of a child were entirely overwritten by the demands of the box office. His body, his mind, and his very identity were being systematically disassembled to build the foundation of a commercial monstrosity. Devoid of quiet reflection, the American Museum functioned as a loud, chaotic, and heavily unsanitary labyrinth of curated oddities. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, gas lamps, and confined animals. For a 4-year-old standing barely above knee height, this environment was a terrifying sensory overload of monstrous proportions. The physical vulnerability of his condition made the daily exhibitions a literal hazard. The sheer volume of people crowding around his small platform meant a constant threat of being crushed or suffocated. His delicate rib cage, housing organs that were compressed within a stunted frame, had to withstand the stifling heat and the aggressive poking and prodding of skeptical ticket holders. Barnum did not just put the boy in a room. He actively marketed the child's bodily tragedy. He instructed Charles to allow strangers to measure his limbs, turning the boy into a living anatomical specimen. The constant physical contact from unwashed hands exposed his developing immune system to a myriad of diseases. Yet sickness was not an acceptable excuse to cancel a show. Every day, his fragile skeleton was subjected to the jarring vibrations of the museum floors and the exhausting routine of endless standing. The muscles in his legs, which should have been developing through natural play, were instead strained by the rigid postures demanded by his owner. It was a slow, deliberate, physical degradation hidden behind the guise of public entertainment. The $3 contract was a death warrant for his childhood. It meant that his cognitive development was entirely hijacked. Instead of learning to read or interact with peers, his brain was force-fed the mechanics of showmanship. He was learning how to manipulate an audience before he even grasped the basic concepts of human connection. The trauma of this radical displacement was profound. The fundamental bond between parent and child was severed, replaced by a transactional relationship with a wealthy showman. Charles quickly learned that affection and approval were no longer freely given. They had to be earned through absolute obedience and flawless performance on the exhibition platform. This early environment instilled a deep, irreversible psychological conditioning. The boy realized that his only value in the world was intrinsically tied to his physical abnormality and his ability to generate wealth for the man who controlled him. If he failed to perform, if his tiny body gave out under the strain, he would be discarded. The transaction fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Stratton family as well. The carpenter father, initially desperate, soon saw the immense financial potential of his deformed son. The family dynamic shifted from caretakers to complicit managers prioritizing weekly payouts over the physical and emotional safety of their child. This betrayal by his own blood cemented Charles's isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, a solitary asset managed by adults who viewed his pulse only as a rhythm for making money. His tiny 25-inch body was an island, cut off from the mainland of normal human experience, floating in a sea of commercial greed. The anatomy of his stunted growth meant his internal organs were tightly packed within a restricted rib cage. Breathing in the poorly ventilated, dust-filled air of the museum required immense effort from his underdeveloped lungs. Every breath was a physical labor, drawing in the toxic, stagnant air of the 19th century city, slowly compromising his respiratory system. His skeletal structure, frozen at an infantile stage, lacked the necessary bone density to withstand constant, rigorous activity. The repetitive strain of walking, bowing, and standing on unforgiving wooden stages created microfractures within his tiny legs. These hidden injuries were never allowed time to heal, compounding daily as the exhibition schedule intensified. The harsh glare of the gaslight illumination in the museum caused severe strain on his underdeveloped optic nerves. Staring out into the dark, smoke-filled auditorium for hours on end led to chronic headaches and blurred vision. His sensory organs were being battered by an environment built for massive crowds, not for the fragile biology of a preschooler. The clothing forced upon him was not designed for comfort, but for spectacle. Heavy, restrictive fabrics, stiff collars, and tight footwear further constrained his already limited movement. These costumes were physical cages, restricting his blood circulation and exacerbating the physical exhaustion that plagued his every waking hour. The concept of childhood as a protected, sacred time did not exist for someone born with a physical difference in that era. Society viewed anomalies as mistakes of nature, rendering them devoid of standard human rights. Charles's small stature automatically disqualified him from humanity. King the $3 lease seemed like a practical business arrangement to the outside world. Barnum exploited this societal callousness with surgical precision. He knew that the public would not feel guilt staring at a 4-year-old if the child was presented as a bizarre artifact rather than a human being. The strategy was to strip away any relatable childlike qualities, replacing them with a cold performative distance that neutralized empathy. The daily routine was a relentless assault on his tiny biological clock. Forced to stay awake late into the night for evening exhibitions, his natural sleep cycles were violently disrupted. This chronic sleep deprivation severely weakened his immune system, leaving his stunted body highly susceptible to the rampant infections festering within the crowded city. Nutrition was another tool of control. His diet was strictly monitored to ensure he did not experience any sudden, unexpected growth spurts, prioritizing the physical stagnation of the boy over his basic health and vitality. The goal was to preserve the asset in its exact miniature state, denying his body the essential fuel it needed to build strength. The physical space of his existence was entirely dictated by the demands of the show. He was confined to small, elevated platforms, unable to freely explore his environment and develop normal spatial awareness. His world was shrunk down to the size of a wooden box, a physical manifestation of the psychological prison Barnum was building around him. His father's signature on that contract was a profound act of paternal failure. By prioritizing $3 over his son's well-being, the father severed the primal instinct to protect his offspring. This betrayal left a permanent scar on the boy's psyche, teaching him early that love and protection were conditional, strictly dependent on his market value. The psychological weight of being a primary breadwinner at the age of 4 is an incomprehensible burden. Charles's developing brain was forced to process the reality that his family's financial stability rested entirely on his 25-inch shoulders. This immense pressure crushed any remaining fragments of childlike innocence, replacing it with a grim survivalist mentality. The American Museum itself was a hostile entity. The deafening blare of brass bands, the shrieks of exotic animals, and the constant roar of the New York crowds created a perpetual state of nervous tension. His fragile nervous system was bombarded daily, leaving him in a constant state of hyperarousal and deep, unspoken anxiety. He was frequently paraded in front of crude, aggressive audiences who demanded proof of his reality. Uncouth men would lift him by his fragile arms, testing his weight, while women would pinch his cheeks with startling force. His body was treated as public property, a communal object to be handled, inspected, and discarded once the curiosity was satisfied. The sheer physical exhaustion of these interactions was debilitating. His muscles, barely developed enough to support his small frame, would tremble with fatigue by the end of the day. Yet, the contract demanded compliance, forcing him to stand upright and smile, even as his body screamed for rest and relief. The alienation was absolute. He was surrounded by thousands of people every week, yet he had never been more isolated. He had no peers, no friends, no one who understood the unique, terrifying reality of being trapped in a body that the world viewed as a lucrative joke. Barnum monitored this isolation, ensuring that Charles formed no attachments outside the profitable sphere of the museum. The showman became the central figure in the boy's life, a tyrannical father figure who dispensed approval and punishment based solely on ticket revenue. This toxic dependency twisted the child's understanding of human connection. The $3 contract was the genesis of a lifelong captivity. It was the moment the physical form of Charles Schur, Stratton ceased to be his own and became the foundation of a sprawling commercial empire. The stage was now perfectly set for Barnum to implement the next phase of his horrific vision, a phase that would require the complete destruction of the child's mind. The physical confinement within the American Museum was merely the external framework of Charles Sherwood Stratton's captivity. The true atrocity lay in the systematic chemical dismantling of his developing brain and internal organs. Phineas Taylor Barnum quickly identified a fundamental flaw in simply exhibiting a small child. A stunted toddler elicited pity, and pity was not a scalable emotion for a global entertainment empire. To generate the explosive, morbid curiosity required to sell thousands of tickets daily, Barnum needed to eradicate the child entirely. The boy had to be mutated into a grotesque anomaly, a worldly, cynical adult trapped inside a 25-inch frame. Achieving this illusion required far more than tailored clothing. It demanded the aggressive introduction of toxic substances into a biological system barely out of infancy. At the incredibly vulnerable age of 5, Charles was subjected to forced intoxication. To sell the persona of a sophisticated gentleman, Barnum integrated the consumption of real wine into the boy's daily stage routine. Dispensing with theatrical tricks or colored water, Barnum poured unrefined, heavy 19th century alcohol directly down the throat of a preschooler. Anatomically, a 5-year-old's liver is entirely unequipped to produce the enzymes necessary to metabolize ethanol. The immediate physical reaction was brutal. The coarse liquid burned the delicate mucosal lining of his underdeveloped esophagus, triggering severe gastric distress in a stomach the size of a small apple. Yet the audience saw none of this internal trauma. They saw a tiny man raising a glass, and they roared with laughter as the alcohol breached his pediatric blood-brain barrier, Delibi, irately impairing his motor skills to elicit a stumbling, drunken performance that Barnum marketed as high comedy. The chemical assault escalated radically when Charles turned 7. Barnum forced the boy to incorporate heavy, unfiltered cigars into his act. The visual of a child, who should have been learning to read, portraying the rough habits of grown men, was a masterstroke of shock value. The reality behind the curtain was a daily regimen of harsh physical demands. A small developing body possesses a restricted physical capacity. Consequently, performing these adult routines placed immense strain on his system. On stage, however, he was trained to suppress his natural reflexes. The incorporation of mature vices into his act was not merely for show. Many historians suggest it was a calculated method designed to secure box office receipts. The audience applauded the spectacle of a tiny man adopting adult mannerisms. They were blind to the lasting toll being taken right before their eyes. These practices served a dual purpose for Barnum. They provided the visual shock necessary for the act. More insidiously, researchers believe they acted as behavioral tethers. By introducing a young performer to such a demanding environment, Barnum ensured steady compliance. The natural energetic impulses of a young boy were systematically suppressed. Charles was kept in a highly controlled setting. This made him entirely dependent on his employer. His natural development was intentionally interrupted, locking him into the adult persona that generated the revenue. Parallel to this physical toll was a profound psychological shift. Barnum recognized that a true miniature man must exhibit adult behaviors. Consequently, he provided scripts heavily laden with mature themes. Charles was rigorously trained to mimic the social and romantic routines of grown men. He was forced to perform adult social rituals and deliver punchlines he could not possibly comprehend. He was mimicking the behaviors of cynical adults. The audience rewarded this with deafening applause. This behavioral conditioning disrupted his natural cognitive milestones. A child relies on a stable environment to develop a healthy understanding of human boundaries. Charles's reality was a twisted, transactional pantomime. Unnatural mimicry was his primary tool for survival and approval. Every time he recited a scripted joke, a piece of his childhood psychology was likely fractured. It was replaced by a rigid, artificial construct designed solely to make strangers laugh. Barnum further stripped the boy of his identity. He forced him into a relentless rotation of historical caricatures. One prominent role was that of Napoleon Bonaparte. The psychological weight of this act was profound. Barnum placed a physically vulnerable child into a heavy, tailored military uniform. He was to play history's most aggressive conqueror. The thick costume severely restricted his movement. They compressed his fragile frame as he was forced to march up and down the wooden stage for hours. The crowd howled at the irony of the world's smallest boy portraying a megalomaniac. Meanwhile, the boy himself suffered under the suffocating weight of the costume. Equally disturbing was his forced portrayal of mythological figures like Cupid. Dressed in fragile theatrical attire and heavy wings, Charles was paraded under the harsh gaslights. The sheer physical vulnerability of his frame was exploited to the maximum. He was forced to strike rigid poses, drawing the intense gaze of the public. Stripped of personhood, he he functioned solely as a blank canvas. He absorbed the bizarre fascinations projected by the paying audience. The cold drafts of the theater bit into his skin, but he was forbidden to break character. He had to maintain the unnatural posture of a statue until the final curtain dropped. The repetition of this routine was staggering. Charles performed these grueling acts hundreds of times a month. His nervous system was constantly flooded with exhaustion. Over time, a tragic psychological conditioning likely took hold. The harsh environment of the stage became inextricably linked with the applause of the crowd. He was conditioned to associate his own physical depletion with validation. The public's joy was directly fueled by his silent struggle. Behind this daily spectacle was a cold financial ledger. Barnum meticulously tracked the revenue generated by every theatrical act. The data was clear. The more the child's natural state was altered, the more tickets were sold. The boy's well-being was systematically converted into hard currency. Charles was treated as a living commodity. Throughout this ordeal, the isolation of the child was profound. When he suffered from the harsh conditions, he had very few advocates. His biological parents were pacified by a steady income and the illusion of fame. They watched largely from the sidelines. The agony was invisible to the laughing crowds, meticulously hidden beneath theatrical makeup. By the time Charles reached adolescence, it is highly probable that his psychological makeup had been profoundly altered. Years of intense conditioning likely buried his authentic emotional responses. Joy had been reduced to a rehearsed stage direction. The innocent boy was effectively gone, replaced by a deeply conditioned performer. The foundation of the greatest show on earth was built upon the compromised youth of a child. This set the stage for the next phase of Barnum's deception. The harsh realities of this routine were safely locked behind the velvet curtains, but the public consumption of this spectacle required a massive fabrication. Barnum knew that the true nature of exploiting a young child would eventually trigger moral outrage. Even in a society indifferent to child welfare, the stark reality carried a risk of backlash. To sanitize the exhibition, Barnum engineered a colossal bulletproof deception. He did not merely alter the boy's biography. He executed a complete assassination of Charles Sherwood Stratton's true existence, replacing the bleeding, exhausted child with a highly profitable phantom. The cornerstone of this massive fraud was the brazen falsification of the child's age. With the stroke of a pen, Barnum legally and publicly erased 7 years of biological truth, declaring the terrified 4-year-old to be an 11-year-old prodigy. Moving far beyond a harmless exaggeration, this specific chronological lie operated as a highly calculated psychological weapon. By shifting the child's age into early adolescence, Barnum instantly neutralized any accusation of child abuse. An 11-year-old drinking and smoking on a theater stage was viewed as a bizarre marvel, a freakish imitation of adulthood that audiences could laugh at without the burden of guilt. If the ticket buyers believed they were looking at an adolescent trapped in a 25-inch frame, they could comfortably ignore the trembling hands and the confused, terrified eyes of a toddler. This chronological lie demanded an agonizing cognitive performance from the boy. A 4-year-old brain, still struggling with basic emotional regulation and spatial awareness, was violently forced to process and project the life experience of a preteen. Charles was ordered to memorize complex, fabricated memories of a childhood he never lived. When journalists or curious aristocrats leaned in to question him, he could not seek the comfort of his mother or speak of his genuine fears. He was drilled under threat of punishment to recite perfectly rehearsed anecdotes about his fictional past. The cognitive dissonance was catastrophic. The boy was effectively forbidden from ever speaking the truth about his own existence, trapping his developing mind in a labyrinth of calculated deceit. To further isolate the child from any potential rescue or recognition, his Earth name was systematically eradicated from all public records and promotional materials. Charles Sherwood Stratton ceased to exist the moment the printing presses began churning out the broadsheets. In his place stood General Tom Thumb, a fictional entity completely owned and copyrighted by Barnum. This renaming was a brutal act of psychological ownership. The boy was stripped of his family lineage, his hometown, and his basic human dignity. He answered only to a circus moniker, a punchline printed in bold ink across thousands of city walls. Every time the crowd chanted the fabricated name, they were driving another nail into the coffin of his true identity, reinforcing the horrifying reality that the boy from Connecticut was dead, replaced entirely by a commercial asset. Barnum then wrapped this fabricated age and stolen identity in a thick layer of geographical fraud. To elevate the attraction from a local oddity to an international sensation, he boldly proclaimed that the general was a distinguished European aristocrat, recently imported at great expense. This transatlantic lie served a dual sinister purpose. First, it completely deflected any local authorities or journalists who might attempt to investigate the boy's true origins in nearby Bridgeport. By placing his fictional birthplace an ocean away, Barnum severed the child from his actual geography, making verification impossible in an era before rapid communication. Secondly, the European origin story added a crucial veneer of prestige and sophistication, which justified the exorbitant ticket prices and the lavish miniature velvet suits. The American public, hungry for culture and easily seduced by the allure of European nobility, swallowed the deception without a single drop of skepticism. Barnum manipulated the press with surgical precision, planting paid editorials and fabricated reviews in major newspapers long before the boy even arrived in a new city. He bribed journalists to report on the fiction of European tours, creating a staggering wall of fake news that the public accepted as gospel. Charles was forced to sit in drawing rooms and listen to adults confidently discuss his fictional aristocratic lineage, completely helpless to correct them. The architecture of the lie was so vast and so aggressively marketed that the truth became entirely irrelevant. The sheer scale of this public manipulation forced Charles to internalize the deception at a cellular level. He had to suppress every natural vocal inflection of a young child, straining his underdeveloped vocal cords to mimic the deeper, measured cadence of an older boy. His posture had to reflect the arrogant confidence of a seasoned performer, hiding the severe physical exhaustion and joint pain that plagued his every movement. He was constantly scrutinized by thousands of eyes, searching for a crack in the illusion. The psychological terror of making a mistake, of letting the facade slip and revealing the frightened toddler beneath, was a crushing, invisible weight. He lived in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, knowing that the wrath of his owner would be swift and merciless if the commercial illusion was ever compromised. This manufactured identity allowed the audience to become eager, guiltless accomplices in his destruction. The lie provided a comfortable psychological buffer. The wealthy elites, the politicians, and the middle-class families who flocked to the exhibitions could watch a tiny body being subjected to immense physical and psychological strain, and instead of feeling horror, they felt entertained. Barnum had successfully weaponized the public's gullibility, turning their desire for spectacle into a shield that protected his abusive practices. The audience paid for the privilege of being deceived, and in doing so, they funded the systematic eradication of Charles Stratton's humanity. The deception was so absolute that it bled into the boy's private reality. His own parents, having leased him away, addressed him by his stage name in the rare moments they were permitted to see him. They became employees of the illusion, enforcing the lie rather than protecting their son. Charles was entirely surrounded by adults who were financially invested in maintaining the fiction that he was someone else. There was no safe haven, no quiet room where he could simply be a 4-year-old boy. The fictional persona had completely parasitized his host, consuming his thoughts, his words, and his future. He was a prisoner, locked inside a character of another man's creation, a ghost haunting his own physical body while the world cheered for the phantom that had stolen his life. As the biological reality of adulthood finally caught up with the fabricated timeline, the psychological conditioning inflicted upon Charles Sherwood Stratton proved irreversible. The boy had survived the toxic intake of his forced childhood, but the man was entirely incapable of existing outside the commercial terrarium Phineas Taylor Barnum had built. The absolute climax of this parasitic control occurred when Charles's most intimate, fundamental human desires were hijacked and converted into a massive retail event. When Charles met Lavinia Warren, another little person employed by the American Museum, the natural human inclination toward companionship was immediately seized by the machinery of the circus. What should have been a private, delicate courtship between two individuals navigating a world built for giants was instantly weaponized into a highly publicized corporate merger. Barnum did not see a blossoming romance. He saw the ultimate marketing campaign, an opportunity to commodify the very concept of love and sell it at a premium to a public desperate for distraction. The monetization of their intimacy was swift and brutal. The engagement was stripped of any personal sanctity and announced as a major theatrical attraction. The public was actively invited to consume their relationship, paying admission merely to watch the couple interact in the museum's reception rooms. Every shared glance, every whispered conversation, and every physical touch was scrutinized by thousands of paying spectators. Charles and Lavinia were denied the basic human right of privacy, forced to perform their affection on demand under the glaring gaslights. The boundary between genuine emotional connection and rehearsed theatrical pantomime collapsed entirely. They were not allowed to be a couple. They were a branded commodity, an interactive exhibit designed to drive ticket sales to unprecedented heights. This exploitation reached its grotesque zenith on February 10th, 1863. While the United States was bleeding through the horrific casualties of the Civil War, Barnum orchestrated a distraction so massive it momentarily eclipsed the national trauma. Rather than a holy sacrament, the wedding of Charles Stratton and Lavinia Warren at Grace Church manifested as a highly calculated, heavily ticketed corporate spectacle. Barnum transformed the subsequent reception at the Metropolitan Hotel into a chaotic, overwhelming commercial event, distributing and selling access to an astonishing 10,000 guests. The streets of Manhattan were paralyzed by the sheer volume of crowds desperate to witness the union of the world's most famous miniature captives. The physical toll of this manufactured celebration was grueling. Charles and Lavinia were forced to stand atop a grand piano for hours just to be visible to the surging, aggressive mob of the elite and the curious. They were trapped in heavy, elaborate wedding attire, their small frames enduring the stifling heat of thousands of closely packed bodies and the relentless blinding flashes of early photographic equipment. They were expected to shake thousands of hands, to smile continuously, and to act as grateful hosts while their physical endurance was pushed to the absolute breaking point. There was no space for joy, only the crushing pressure to execute a flawless performance on the most exhausting workday of their lives. They were the centerpieces of a grand feast, consumed visually by a society that viewed their marriage as an amusing novelty rather than a sacred bond. Even the memories of the day were entirely fabricated for mass consumption. Barnum did not wait for the actual ceremony to capture the event. He had the couple dressed in their wedding attire days in advance, posing them in the cold, mechanical environment of Matthew Brady's photographic studio. These staged images were mass-produced as carte de visite photographs, ready to be sold in the thousands the moment the church doors opened. This visual record of their union bypassed genuine emotion entirely, serving strictly as a calculated, mass-produced inventory of merchandise. Charles was actively participating in the commercialization of his own life milestones, his personal history meticulously scripted and retailed by the man who owned his public identity. The darkest, most morally bankrupt act of this lifelong theatrical production occurred in the years following the wedding. The public, thoroughly invested in the narrative of the perfect miniature family, inevitably demanded an heir. When biology did not instantly provide one, the commercial machine simply manufactured a solution. To sustain the lucrative illusion of domestic bliss and satisfy the relentless curiosity of the ticket buyers, Barnum resorted to a practice that shattered any remaining fragments of Charles's reality. The showman began renting infants. When the couple went on tour, local orphanages or impoverished families were paid to hand over their babies, who were then thrust onto the stage and presented to the screaming crowds as the biological offspring of General Tom Thumb and Lavinia. The psychological devastation inflicted upon Charles by this specific deception is difficult to overstate. He was forced to stand under the harsh theater lights, holding a borrowed, often crying infant that did not belong to him. He had to project the profound pride of a new father, mimicking the deepest of human connections with a temporary prop that would be returned to an institution as soon as the local run of shows concluded. This was a daily, violent assault on his psyche. He was acting out a family life that was entirely hollow, forced to lie about the most fundamental biological act of human existence. The rented babies were merely an extension of the cigars and the wine of his childhood, tools used to manipulate the audience's emotions and extract their money. This routine completely erased the final distinction between Charles Stratton, the human being, and General Tom Thumb, the commercial entity. His entire existence was now a closed loop of profitable lies. His name was fake, his age had been falsified for decades, his childhood was a script, his wedding was a ticketed exhibit, and his own child was a rented theatrical prop. He was trapped in a suffocating, inescapable fiction. The crowds wept tears of joy looking at the staged family unit, completely oblivious to the hollow, agonizing reality of the man holding the borrowed infant. The public's appetite for the heart-warming illusion actively funded the complete psychological annihilation of the individual performing it. The wealth accumulated from decades of relentless exhibition was staggering, enough to have permanently freed Charles Sherwood Stratton from the stage by the time he was merely 9 years old. Yet the tragedy of absolute institutionalization is that the prisoner eventually learns to crave the bars of his own cell. He did not retire. He could not. The psychological conditioning inflicted by Phineas Taylor Barnum had completely rewired his neurological reward system. Charles openly confessed to a crippling addiction to the roaring crowds and the blinding lights of the auditorium. Silence, for a man whose entire existence had been scored by brass bands and the shrieks of paying customers, was terrifying. He possessed no identity outside the fabricated perimeter of General Tom Thumb. To step down from the wooden platform meant stepping into a void where he was no longer a global marvel, but simply a severely stunted, exhausted man. The stage was a torturous environment, but it was the only ecosystem in which he knew how to breathe. The physical bill for his manufactured childhood finally came due. The human body keeps a strict ledger, and Stratton's internal architecture was heavily compromised. At age 5, Barnum had introduced heavy alcohol to create a drunken gentleman act. By 7, unfiltered cigars were added for visual shock. Decades of this toxic routine inside a 25-inch frame severely restricted his pulmonary pathways and left his vascular network irreparably fragile. Paradoxically, as his biological system failed, his financial power grew. Stratton did not remain a helpless captive. He amassed a massive personal fortune, purchased elite real estate, and acquired his own yacht. The ultimate power shift occurred in 1856. When P.T. Barnum faced total bankruptcy, it was the 25-inch former sideshow attraction who bailed out his creator, becoming an equal business partner. Yet this immense wealth could not buy back his biological integrity. The medical reality was a cardiovascular system, silently collapsing under the weight of his early conditioning. The inevitable collapse of this exhausted biological machine occurred with brutal suddenness on July 15, 1883. At the relatively young age of 45, the immense physiological strain finally shattered his vascular network. A massive stroke violently severed the connection between his conditioned brain and his battered body. There was no theatrical buildup, no final curtain call, only the sudden fatal rupture of blood vessels that had been pushed to the breaking point for 40 solid years. His death was not a peaceful surrender to time. It was the ultimate desperate rebellion of a physical form that could simply no longer sustain the punishing demands of the commercial fiction it was forced to inhabit. The engine of the greatest show on earth had finally seized. Yet, the absolute ownership exerted over him did not dissolve with his last breath. Even as his physical body lay cold, the commercial machinery of his existence continued to turn. Barnum, recognizing that a dead asset could still generate publicity, orchestrated a final permanent act of exploitation. He commissioned a life-size statue of the fictional General Tom Thumb to be mounted atop a towering obelisk at Charles's grave in Mountain Grove Cemetery. This was not a monument to a beloved son or a grieving husband. It was a permanent billboard carved in stone. Barnum ensured that the fabricated circus persona literally stood upon the chest of the real man buried in the dirt below. It was a final assertion of dominance, guaranteeing that visitors would forever look up at the intellectual property rather than down at the human remains. Charles Sherwood Stratton lived and died under the crushing weight of a society that valued spectacle far above humanity. He traversed the globe, amassed a fortune, and stood before queens. Yet he was fundamentally a captive from the age of 4 until the day his heart gave out. His legacy forces a harsh confrontation with the predatory nature of entertainment. exposing how a vulnerable physical form can be hijacked, consumed, and discarded for the amusement of the masses. He was the foundation of an empire built on stolen childhoods and poisoned lungs. When the applause finally faded and the theater doors locked, all that remained was the silent, tragic reality of a man who paid for the world's entertainment with the total annihilation of his own life. The shadow of Charles Sherwood Stratton stretches far beyond the gaslit stages of the 19th century, serving as the terrifying blueprint for the modern industrialization of childhood. We frequently look back at the American Museum as a barbaric relic of an unregulated past. Yet the fundamental mechanics of Barnum's exploitation remain deeply embedded in the contemporary entertainment industry. The commodification of youth, the relentless psychological pressure, and the willing complicity of parents did not die with the circus. The child stars of early Hollywood studios, who were routinely administered chemical stimulants to endure grueling back-to-back filming schedules, and the modern digital influencers, whose every personal milestone is aggressively monetized for public consumption, are the direct descendants of the General Tom Thumb phenomenon. Charles was simply patient zero in a cultural epidemic that systematically equates a child's physical existence with their capacity to generate revenue. His life forces a deeply uncomfortable historical debate regarding the exact point at which parental guardianship dissolves into a socially acceptable form of human trafficking. The true tragedy of his existence lies not only in the isolated horror of his physical deterioration, but in the grim reality that the financial model of his exploitation proved so incredibly lucrative that society fundamentally refused to dismantle it. The entertainment complex still ruthlessly strip mines the formative years of the vulnerable, packaging their psychological degradation into easily consumable media. The public continues to demand the spectacle of the extraordinary, and the machinery relentlessly supplies it, always at the direct cost of the performer's psychological and physical survival. Ultimately, the story of the small boy from Bridgeport is a harrowing mirror reflecting our own continuous complicity as an audience. It strips away the velvet and the diamonds of global celebrity, leaving us with a profound, chilling reality about the price of applause. If the foundation of our entertainment is built upon the silent, invisible destruction of the human beings performing for us, how much human suffering are we willing to actively endorse just to keep the show running?